This episode of the Boss Builder podcast is brought to you by New England Lean Consulting. New England Lean Consulting is the Northeast's premier business consulting firm, helping small to medium-sized businesses implement strategic leadership and operational methodologies that help to lower costs, increase capacity, and win more customers. Their consultants provide guidance on the latest business solution, including Lean, Six Sigma, ISO, as well as energy conservation and safety compliance to help you grow your business deliberately and strategically. Through their planned methods, you'll be able to sustain and build a long-term operational excellence advantage over your competition. To contact them, go to newenglandleanconsulting.com, or you can contact them by phone at 860-335-4787. Well, hello and welcome to this episode of the Boss Builder podcast, the podcast for those of you who are new to management, those who are in the role and struggling, or even those of you who are simply kicking the tires to see if it's something for you. My name is Mac Monroe. I'm your host, the founder and CEO of Boss Builders. Today we're actually going to talk about something called Lean. Lean is a process that is used in manufacturing but is applicable in any industry. And it's something that you as the boss, I think, would find fascinating and very useful. Our guest today is Paul Critchley. Paul Critchley is the president and CEO of New England Lean Consulting. He is from the Northeast. He's a good friend of mine. I've known Paul for a number of years. Paul is a crazy smart guy. He's got some awesome stories, and he's going to tell you what Lean is, why you should think about implementing it, some questions that you should be asking, and if you as the boss are taking this as a project, what are some things that you must focus on? He'll end up with some really good suggestions for you, and I think you're going to find his information very valuable. So with no further delay, let's meet our guest, Paul Critchley. Paul Critchley, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Max. Good to be here.
Yeah, hey, I'm glad we were able to connect. Paul, I've known you for several years now, and before I get into some questions about Lean, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your background and maybe even the place where we met. Gosh, it's been, about 7 years ago, I guess.
Yeah, it's been a while. So yeah, I'm a degree mechanical engineer. Graduated and moved to Connecticut a week later. I've lived here ever since. So along the way, I worked at a bunch of different places. Where you and I met was at Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford. So I used to work there and working on making jet engine parts for the United States military. Along the way, I worked at night, got a couple of master's degrees, one in management, one in organizational leadership. So I was able to leverage those. But I spent my whole career on the shop floor as a manufacturing engineer and then an ME manager and plant manager, like I said, at a bunch of different places. And then back in 2012, I started New England Lean Consulting, and I've been doing that ever since.
That's great. Yeah. Well, the title of the podcast is What Does the Boss Need to Know About Lean? So I think let's start at the basics. What is Lean? What's it mean? And where did it come from?
Sure. So a good question, because admittedly, it's kind of funny to think about, but there's a lot of misconstrue around what Lean really is. So Lean's just a term that was coined in a book called The Machine That Changed the World. And actually, if you want to be specific, that term first was published in an MIT paper in 1988. And basically what happened was there was a team from MIT that went over to Japan and Toyota to find out how in the heck these guys were kicking the butts of the American automotive manufacturers back at that time. And what they found was what Toyota was doing was called the Toyota Production System. So Jim Womack, Dan Jones wrote a book called The Machine That Changed the World. And that's what really popularized the term Lean. But really, Lean is just that. It's just a term. It's continuous improvement. It is a little bit different than Six Sigma, which maybe some of your listeners may or may not have heard of. That's a little more statistical. There's also theory of constraints, but it's all basically the same stuff. And I want to point this out. It's not really new. This stuff's been around since the Industrial Revolution and probably before. It's just a manner by which any operation, not necessarily manufacturing, but any operation or organization can go about making things operate a little bit better and more efficiently. And that's basically it. There's a lot of offshoots that, come from that. There's a lot of different tools and methods that have been developed over the decades. But in a nutshell, that's basically what it is. It's just, what do you do today and how do you make it a little bit better tomorrow?
Okay, well, it has its roots in manufacturing, and that's kind of where I had always heard about it. But I do hear that even some healthcare organizations are getting into this. So how does lean impact, let's just say, healthcare and, maybe other industries you've seen? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, no, sure. All right. So, for instance, in healthcare, I'll give you a real world example. My father had open heart surgery last year. So I was up in Maine visiting with him, staying with him. And on that floor that he was on were a bunch of other people who were also having either open heart surgery or stents put in or whatever, right? So there's X number of nurses that are there that roam around. They have the rounds that they do, and they have to go take care of their patients. And probably in the week that I was there with him, and I wasn't even there all day, every day, I probably saw 3 or 4 times where his nurse would come in and they have a cart. And on that cart, there's all kinds of different stuff, right, that they need. So they're in there and they're taking care of my dad and asking him questions. And like I said, 3 or 4 times, another nurse came into the room to get something off of that cart that they didn't have on the cart that they had, or maybe they didn't even have a cart. What I found out later was they didn't have enough carts for every nurse in every room because, it's one of those things you don't need this stuff all the time. But the way they hadn't balanced the workflow, and it's really hard to do that, especially in a situation like that, because you never know what questions patients are going to have or what you're going to need and that kind of stuff. So they kind of just accepted it as the way it was. But from a lean person perspective, I'm watching this, and now that nurse who came into my dad's room was not with the patient that they wanted to be with. They weren't providing care. They were off, right, to go get gauze or a blood pressure cuff or whatever it was that they were looking for. That's the kind of stuff that lean talks about. People do their jobs because that's what they want to do. They get some intrinsic value out of it. I'm an engineer because that's kind of how I'm hardwired. Teachers are the same way. Nurses are the same way. And it's very frustrating for folks when they can't be what they really are because they have to go and they have to do all this other stuff. What I would call a wasteful activity.
Well, we try to meet up and have dinner whenever I come up to Connecticut. And I remember you telling me maybe it was a year or so ago, you had taken your family to some amusement park and were waiting in line. And it seems like your brain is always looking for a better way to do things. I think you had mentioned you had observed how their line was going and you were going to try to reach out. So, you're a lean guy, but how long have you had this mindset, Paul?
It's fun. I don't think I ever told you this story, but it's been for a long time. So it's real quick. When I was in 5th grade, I got busted in school for talking in class. So I got held in for recess. And my punishment was I will not talk in class. I had to write I will not talk in class on the chalkboard. And that gives you an idea how long ago this was because we actually had real chalk. I had to write it up on the board and I had to fill the board up. So the teachers, Mr. Fuller says, here, this is what you need to do. I'm going to go eat my lunch. Now, recess was only like half an hour long or something. And looking back, of course, the whole idea is that it's much more work, than it's going to take than time I have in recess. So I'm going to be inside the whole time. So I start writing this thing out and I quickly realized I'm like, this isn't going to work. Well, we had these things that they're like a piece of wood and they're probably about a foot long. And they have these 5 giant paper clip things coming off of them. And what we use these for, teachers would stick chalk in the paper clips and then they would drag it across the board to make lines. And that's how we would practice cursive up on the chalkboard. So I grabbed this thing and I loaded it up with chalk and I just wrote, so I could write 5 sentences at once, right? So Mr. Fuller comes back in like 10, 15 minutes and I'm basically almost done. And he's just looking at me. And he starts laughing. He's like, just go outside. So I'm like, well, there you go. Right. So it works out. So it's been, that kind of a thing. I just, for whatever reason, when I look at processes or instances, it's just kind of, I guess, how I'm wired in my head.
Well, I'm just wondering, this is designed for bosses to hear. So what kind of role does the boss play into putting lean in place? And can you teach a person to think like you do?
So the first answer is a very large role. Lean or continuous improvement starts at the top. And if leadership and management are not supportive of it, it's not going to work. It's going to flat out fail. And I advise people and some clients that don't even start, because all you're going to do is it's going to fail. And then when you want to try to do this again in 3-6 months, a year, you're going to have a much larger uphill battle on your hands. And so the answer to your second question is yes, absolutely. We can teach folks how to think and how to see. There's actually a book written several years ago called Learning to See. And it's all about value stream mapping, which is a lean tool. But it's basically, how do you look at a process or, an organization and how they do things, and look for waste, look for inefficiencies. And that is a trainable thing. It doesn't come naturally to everybody. I'll tell you, generally, engineers catch on pretty quick, because that's almost part of our training. We're taught to look for how to squeeze, especially in the industrial engineering section. We're kind of trained to look for how do you squeeze as much out of this process as you can. But it's very important, like I said, that leadership and management are not only supportive, but they have to understand the tools and the methods. Because again, without that, they're not able to answer questions and they're not able to support, and it's going to wind up, it just won't work.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of curious on that note too, is, has lean been widely adopted, I guess, starting in the US, and what challenges do you see and what challenges have there been?
So, it's funny. You and I were chatting before we started. I just got back from speaking at a conference in San Diego for AME, which is the Association for Manufacturing Excellence. And the class I taught was on employee engagement. And one of the discussions that the class and I had was about just this, and how it's funny in a not humorous way that, this whole movement has been around for 30 years, yet here we are most of the way through 2018. And there are organizations that are still struggling with, continuous improvement, and how do we do it? And how do we practice it? I tend to shy away from the implement, word. But the answer is no. It hasn't gotten that widely accepted within manufacturing, and certainly healthcare, as well as other service industries. I would say that awareness is very large and very widespread. But the number of folks who really have a good understanding of it and are actively, working at it, I think has been, within the lean community, I think we kind of recognize that it's been less than what we had hoped for. And there are lots of different reasons for that. Even the term lean, I'll tell you, I've heard Jim Womack speak, and he knows that it was his books basically that popularized that term. So when I heard him speak last year, he said, I wish we hadn't used that term, because when people think lean, they think skinny, or they think, trim the fat, do more with less, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of those things have almost a negative connotation, because very quickly, especially with folks on the shop floor or in the front lines of an organization, they start thinking, wait a second, I know what it takes to do this process right now, and we have 10 people. And, you're telling me that we only need 5 or 7. So what's going to happen to those other 3 or 5 people? Like, they're just not going to be needed, and they're going to get laid off or fired or what have you. And that's like rule number 1 of lean, is you have to tell everybody, and you have to mean it. Nobody's going to lose their job because we're doing these things. When you, I'll say, lean out a process, those people that you end up not needing, you can take and you put somewhere else. And the best thing to do with those folks is put them on another lean initiative somewhere else in your organization. And then and it so on, and it's a momentum builder. So those things, again, once over, okay, well, we're done here. Let's go over to this other manufacturing cell, and so on and so forth. And that's how you build momentum. So I'll tell you, I've worked for places who made that mistake. So there was one particular manufacturer I'm thinking of. They had a lot of different cells. They took one cell to what they call gold, and 6 months later, that cell was shipped overseas. And there were lots of business reasons, I'm told, that were the reason for that. But of course, everybody that was close to it only saw, hey, they put all this work into it, and they made the work very easy to do, and then it all went away. And that was about the last time that folks on the shop floor and leadership and management saw eye to eye on exactly what lean was there to do.
Well, I guess it's going to be an uphill battle, but it seems like it makes sense. I've been around long enough to see companies that go through phases like that. And I've seen some that try to make it almost a flavor of the month. We're going to do TQM, and then we're going to do lean, and then we're going to do process improvement. And I always see the resistance come from people that are just kind of sick of people trying to shake up the status quo. And so from your perspective, Paul, why do you think people push back on change? And is that even a real thing, or is it just something we get caught up in?
Good question. I don't, my personal opinion, I don't think that people resist change so much as, and I forget who this quote came from, but basically it's that people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And that's where I think it's an important, nuance. We change every day. There are things that we do. Of course, we all have our routines, but, like our kids just started school, right? So we have a new routine that we have to get used to. And then a few weeks after that, I have two daughters, and they dance. So 5 nights a week, we have to change things. And as a consultant, I'm traveling quite a bit. So there are days when, I'll need my wife to do something that I would normally do, and vice versa if she's busy, right? So there's change around us all the time. I think that when people have some amount of control over that change, that they're much, much more comfortable versus if, I walk into an organization, or, a manager or a leader comes back from a conference and says, hey guys, guess what? I found this new thing. I heard about it. It's lean. We're going to go do this. And isn't this going to be great? That's that's forcing the change onto people. One of the things I referenced in the class I just gave was WeFM, everybody's favorite radio station, and it's WIIFM. In other words, what's in it for me? And you really have to, as a boss, you have to be mindful of where folks are coming from. For instance, if I'm on a shop floor, right, and I'm punching the clock and I'm running a machine, I may or may not care as much if the company's more efficient, or, shareholders, if it's publicly traded, are going to make more money. Like that doesn't, what does that do for me? That's all very well and good. I guess I'm happy to contribute, but me personally, it doesn't do anything for me. Well, that's true. But the same is true. I can say, when I walk into a shop and I say, okay, I heard you, but what if I could tell you that your life's going to get a whole heck of a lot easier? Like, you're not going to get yelled at by your boss because these things, you're continuously late because you have a lot of waste in this process. And I understand you didn't put it there, but when we get all these wasteful activities out, i.e. going to look for a wrench because it's not where you need it, it's over in a toolbox and somebody moved the toolbox or they took the wrench out or whatever, right? So you lose a bunch of time every day, and it's frustrating, right? Because when you come in, you want to just do your work, right? Yeah, right. So that's usually the answer I'll get. I'll say, okay, well, imagine what life would be like if you walked in and everything you needed was where it was every single time. So that's, they start to say, okay, I get it. And as we implement things like point of use tooling or 5S or any of this kind of stuff, people will come back and say, I wasn't too sure about it because it didn't sound right. Because it's one of those things that sounds so simple. It's like we should be doing this already. But once we get that momentum going, they'll come back and say, you know what, you were right. And it's, now I actually get more done. I'm less frustrated when I leave here, because nobody likes to leave work feeling like they didn't get done what they needed to, or what their boss wanted them to do, or what they were expected to do, right? Makes you feel like a little bit of a failure. And it's really hard to get up the next day and go do that all over again, right? So it's one of those things like, all right, well, we tried it that way. We know what we're going to get. Let's do something different. Let's try that, see if it's any better. And that's really all it comes down to, is just that cycle of, let's try it. And if it's better, great. And that's the new norm. And then we can do something else and try it over again.
Well, you convinced me. I think it would be something important. So the last couple questions I have are going to be for the boss. So let's first talk about the boss who has listened to this and says, yeah, we need to put this in place. What advice would you give them? And then I'm going to have a follow-on question to that.
Okay. So I guess first things first is make sure you get your people on board. And when I say on board, I mean invested. And invested is even beyond bought in. So invested to me means, here's this idea, and it might be foreign to you, but here's what I'm thinking. But then the boss has to ask this question, but what do you think? And then they have to shut up and listen to what they're going to hear back. The people who do the work every single day know what needs to be done. Sometimes they need to be prompted with the right questions in order to pull it out of them. But they know, they live the pain every single day. A lot of times, they're just used to it. So, another important question bosses can ask is, well, why do you do it that way? Even before I was a consultant, when I was in industry, I can tell you that was one of my most powerful questions, because a lot of times the answer would be, well, because that's the way we've always done it. Okay, well, why? And then I jump into the 5 whys. Well, why? Why is that? Why is that? And I can't tell you, there's numerous times where we get down to the bottom of it, and there really was no good reason. That person had been trained to do it that way, and the person who trained them was long gone. And that's just had been their personal preference. So that's the way they taught folks, and it worked and it was fine. So that's just the way everybody kept doing it, and they never made any improvements. So really, it's getting investment from your people by talking to them, asking them questions, and listening to their answers.
Well, then let's address what happens when you've done that hard work and now you've implemented lean. And, I see this a lot too. The initial phase is exciting and we're seeing change. And then you kind of get it to where it's that space where no one's thinking about it. What can the boss do to keep the momentum going?
So that's a very good question, because I'll tell you, sustainment is the hardest part, because you're right. It's when it's a new and shiny thing, everyone's very excited about it. And you get a little sugar rush kind of at the beginning. And then after that wears off, sometimes it can turn into a bit of a grind. So, and that's up to the boss, and they have to help combat that. So it's all about their language. Are they out there, what I would call doing Gemba walks, which is a Japanese term, but it's loosely translated to go and see, where the work is actually happening. They got to make sure that they're out there and they're visible, and they have to make sure that they're maintaining, the same language that, to reiterate these things. Guys, this is important. I do recognize that you're still working at it. You're still trying. And that's all I ask, right? It's all you got to do is make it a little bit better today than it was yesterday. I just quoted this because I am a Sox fan, so I'm very excited. Right, we just won the World Series, but I always say, so I referenced this in the class I just gave. Lean is small ball. We get excited about home runs, but 9 times out of 10, you're winning a ball game through doubles and singles, and that's what lean is. Lean is stringing together a lot of doubles and singles. In other words, small improvements along the way. And then a month, 2, 3, 6, months down the line, you look back and you think, wow, we actually have come a long way. It's a lot less, we do hit home runs every once in a while, but you can't count on those. And then, like I said, it can turn into a grind, but it's a matter of, again, leadership being visible out on the floor, keeping people's attitudes, in a positive place. And then you got to celebrate the wins, no matter how small. I'm a big fan of KPIs, key performance indicators, or just goals. Publish those things, put them on a big chart. out on the shop floor and say, guys, this is what we need for, efficiency or sales or whatever your goal is. And if we hit it, I'll have the ice cream truck come in. I've had up around here, we have a converted fire truck that a guy turned into a pizza oven. So we had them come one time after we hit a goal. So it's just stuff like that. People just want to know that you see what they're doing and that you appreciate them. People don't leave jobs because of money. That's usually like the third reason. A lot of times it's because they couldn't get along with their boss because they were micromanaged, or they didn't feel like they were making a difference. They didn't feel like anybody cared. So, 3.5 million Americans quit their job every month. And you think about the waste that generates between having to go find a replacement person, get them trained. Do you even have good training documents? Because a lot of organizations don't, because they never took the time. That's a lot of churn to try to overcome. And with a few small tweaks, we could avoid all of those, delays and costs and all that stuff. So that's kind of how I try to approach it when we talk about, what can the boss do?
That's great. Well, it sounds like a lot of this is something that is just good management tools, but I love the idea of the formal process. So, Paul, you really are the guy to work with an organization that wants to implement this. So how can my listeners get a hold of you? How can they find out a little bit more about what your process looks like?
So definitely, look us up on the interwebs. It's newenglandlean.com. That's all one word. And my personal email is paul@newenglandlean.com. And always have. I mean, I had 38 people in the class, and I handed out cards to every one of them. And I said, read our case studies, read my blog. We try to post there quite often and try to make them fun. They're not, they're not preachy, and they're not necessarily tool oriented. These are all stories from me and the folks that work here that we've encountered, and some of them actually can be pretty entertaining. So we try to make it fun, right? Because it's supposed to be. That's what. We spend more hours with our coworkers Monday through Friday than we do our own families. So it's good to try to, infuse a little humor in there. So I'd encourage them to, look us up there and then feel free to reach out. I'm always glad to chat and trade ideas. I do this because I love it. So if I can help, I will.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for spending your time with us on the show. I know you came in at 2 a.m, so you're running on low fumes right now, but thank you for sharing your advice and opinions. And I can I've known Paul for a while. He's the real deal. So please connect with him. Paul, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for being on our show.
Thanks, Mac. I enjoyed it.
Well, and a special thanks again to our guest, Paul Critchley from New England Lean Consulting. You can reach him also by phone at 860-335-4787. As the boss, you know that your learning and development never ends. And so before we hang up this week, why don't we talk a little bit about what we can offer you here at Boss Builders? We have 4 offerings that may be valuable for you. Number 1 is our on-site driving results workshops. Those are on-site by our facilitators in your backyard. You can have your people come, do it in any methodology you want, half day, full day, 3 days, whatever you want. Second offering, of course, is our Boss Builder Academy, our video-driven series. Really practical if you're busy and don't have a lot of time for in-class work. Third option, of course, is we license our driving results curriculum. If you have a training staff and no material, why not contact us? You can license our materials, our tools, our models, the very same things that we talk about a lot on our podcast. And finally, there's an individual subscriber model that you can use, individual per month, also, by the way, available in Spanish. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. If you are listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher or Google, please take a moment and leave us a review. We would be grateful. Until the next time we meet, get out there, boss up, and boss on. Goodbye.